I'm really happy to welcome you to this year's Arnold Harberger Lecture on Economic Development. We've done a number of these over the years. The past lecturers are a pretty illustrious group. We're going to add Jason Furman to that group. Jeff Sachs, Joe Stiglitz, Melinda Gates, last year, Esther Duflo. This year's speaker, Jason Furman, I think continues our tradition of marrying economics to public policy and political questions. I'll introduce Jason properly in a moment, but he's spent really the bulk of his career in public service at a very high level, and it's really terrific to have him here for this. I'll say more in a moment. First, in terms of the format, as soon as I have introduced Jason, he will come up here. Like all economists, he will give a talk with slides. And in fact, there's going to be a lot of slides. I've seen them. They're great. But he will do that, walk around, run us through his talk for about 30 minutes. He and I will sit down in those chairs. We'll have a brief conversation just to kind of kick things off. And then I will open it up to questions from all of you. We have handheld microphones. If you've been to these events before, you know how this works. Please, of course, wait to be called on. Wait for the microphone. And if you can identify yourself and your question, that's terrific. Most importantly, keep your questions short and to the point. There's a lot of people here. We want to make sure we get through a lot of things. So with those kind of ground rules in mind, let me introduce Jason. So Jason Furman is currently Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. For the previous 8 years, he worked as a top economic advisor to President Obama from 2013 to 2017. He was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. He replaced Alan Krueger in that position. In the role of chairman, he played a major, or had a major hand in nearly every important economic policymaking decision that came out of the White House. In appointing him to the chairmanship, President Obama called Jason, and I'm quoting, one of the most brilliant minds of his generation. Jason was born in New York City, attended Harvard College, finished his Ph.D. in economics, also at Harvard, worked at the World Bank, and then in the White House in various roles. This was during the Clinton years. After the Clinton presidency, in addition to working on several campaigns, presidential campaigns, he worked at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities and taught at NYU, Columbia, and Yale. From 2006 to 2008, he was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and director of the Hamilton Project. We maybe want to learn more about what that was. I don't think it's related to Hamilton, the musical. Otherwise, he'd probably not be here with us today. But he did that for a couple of years. He then joined President Obama's presidential campaign right at the start, 2008, as economic policy director, and later served in a number of positions before rising to his last role as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Among his many accomplishments in government service, Jason is one of the architects of the Affordable Care Act. So he's covered a lot of ground, a really terrific experience, and someone who I think will be very enlightening, very interesting for all of us today, and I'm really proud to have him here for this lecture. Please join me in welcoming Jason Furman.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me. It's great being here at the Burkle Center at UCLA, and a real honor to be doing something named after Arnold Harberger, who's just such a major role in so many different areas, both of economics and applying it to public policy. And we use his ideas every day when we're in government, engaged in public policy. You know, one slide ago, you saw the title of this was something like Economic Policy Making and the Future of the U.S. Economy. I should just be straight with you up front that my talk is about economic policy making, and then we can cover the future of the U.S. economy in the Q&A, where I'm happy to talk about any issues you want to talk about. But what I wanted to do was take this opportunity, since I'd been in government for 8 years, have not fully recovered from the experience, to share with you some reflections on the role that economics plays in policy making and in government. In the course of that, try to give you a number of different examples and illustrations. For me, just by way of bio, I was in graduate school doing academic research, planning to go on the academic job market and have an academic career. And for me, it was pretty much an accident. One day, Joe Stiglitz, who was then the chair of the CEA, called me up at the recommendation of someone else. He was interviewing me for a job at CEA. His interview consisted of talking for 30 minutes straight, not listening to a word I said, and then viewing me as insightful enough to hire. To me, it seemed a little bit of a change from the track I was on, but there was this woman I really liked. She wasn't paying a lot of attention to me in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She was going to be moving to Washington that summer, and I thought I might have more success if I chased her there, so I took the job. As an aside, I subsequently married her, and that got me into it. And I ended up staying for 4 years in Washington at CEA, Council of Economic Advisors, then at the World Bank with Joe Stiglitz, and then back to the White House at the National Economic Council. And we can talk more about what all these alphabet soup things are later if you want, but in brief, CEA is a little bit more pure economic analysis and economic advice. NEC is a little bit more strategic, runs the process, and makes sure everyone is at the table who needs to be, including, of course, the CEA. But what I wanted to do today was talk about, why, at least the rationalization I have for having gotten off track about 21 years ago and continued to stay off track all of this time. What's so exciting about economic policy? Then get to the question of, do economists ever agree on the answers to questions? Because people see a lot of debates. Most of the issues I've dealt with are places where economists don't know the answer. So what do we do when we don't know the answer? How do we figure it out? And then finally, something a little bit more personal. A lot of the issues that come up center around growth and inequality, trade-offs or complementarities, and how I think about that. So first, what's so exciting about economic policy? For me, I'm excited because it helps you think about some of the big questions. And one of the biggest questions in the US economy is, why has income growth slowed so much? Income from 1948 to 1973 for the typical family was growing at 3% a year. At 3% a year, it doubles every 24 years, or once a generation. Now it's 0.4% a year. It takes more than 150 years to double. And I think that's one of the central facts about our economy. But in economic policy, I was always happy if I could find an opportunity to make a small contribution to a big problem like that. But I also find it interesting and important if you can make a big contribution to a smaller issue. And to give an example of a smaller issue, it's one of the things we all love, maybe love too much, is our mobile devices, our tablets. They get internet by using electromagnetic spectrum. That electromagnetic spectrum gets very crowded with all these different signals at the same time, which makes it harder for them to get broadband, which is one thing important to our economy, important to our consumers. And so figuring out how they could get enough spectrum to have mobile broadband, and I'll come back to it. To give you a sense of some of the issues that I worked on in the last 8 years, one of them was preventing a second Great Depression. One of them was restructuring the post office. And I don't want to be immodest. We only succeeded in one of these two projects. And some of the others were all of these. Some of these are things you would think of as economists working on, like financial crisis, deficit reduction, or business tax reform. Some of these you may be more surprised to see, like criminal justice reform, artificial intelligence, or Social Security. On none of these did we come into the room and get our way, and on none of them should we have come into the room and get our way. But in all of them, we figured out a way to contribute and a way to have input. Part of that input came about because economists do agree. My thesis advisor for my Ph.D. was Greg Mankiw. He had the same job that I had under President Bush. He's a Republican, I'm a Democrat, and Greg and I agree on some of the big issues in our sorry, getting off track here. I want to talk about one more thing I like about economic policy, which is that it lets you combine economics and politics. And a lot of questions in economics are sort of easy. climate change is like a really big problem for the world. It's a really easy thing for economists to solve. You just do a carbon tax. If you're a pollster, it's also a really easy problem to solve because you don't actually care about solving the problem. You just care about making people happy. And if you call up 1,000 people and ask them what would make them happy and have your candidate propose that, that's the best way to win an election. And you just want a tax credit for energy efficient homes. Part of what you do in economic policy is figure out how to combine those two. And there's different ways to combine them. So maybe you could find the very best policy and use a pollster to figure out a different word for it, and I'm making this up, but calling it a future fee instead of a carbon tax. I realize slightly Orwellian, but in the interest of saving the planet, I would be willing to do it. The second is packaging policies together to address the concerns that people raise. So a group of economists recently and leaders came forward with a proposal that had a carbon tax, but it also got rid of a lot of regulations. It rebated the money to people, and it had a tax on imported carbon, and it sort of bought off a lot of the different groups that were opposed to the idea. The most common thing you end up doing, though, is you end up not at the very best policy, but at a policy that you could call the nth best, and then you just hope that n is not too large. And to give you an example of that, when we came into office, we did the Recovery Act. That was a big stimulus plan to get out of the recession. It included a tax credit called Making Work Pay. And the way Making Work Pay worked is it was a refundable tax credit. Refundable means if you're low income, you got a check from the government. If you're high income, it phased out. You didn't get any money. It was, in the opinion of some of its designers, present company included, about as perfect a work of art as you could imagine in the tax system. Except it expired at the end of 2010. The economy had an unemployment rate of 8.5% then. We were really afraid about what would happen when it would go away, and so we went to Congress and said we want to continue it. Republicans said no way. They didn't like this refundable part where we sent checks to people. And so what we did as economic advisors was try to come up with different ideas, and I'm just going to give you a really stylized version of this. Making Work Pay, the thing we had designed, let's say it was 100. And if you don't like the idea, you could think of that out of a scale of 150 or 300 or whatever. Let's just call it 100. The Republican idea that they countered with was the same thing, but you wouldn't give money to any low or moderate income people. We thought that was a 30, because it wasn't giving money to people who needed it and people who were likely to spend it. We came up with another idea, which was a payroll tax cut. That had the advantage of going to everyone, no matter what their earnings were, the disadvantage that didn't go as much to low-income people as we'd like, and it wasn't phased out for high-income people. Let's call it 80. That was the job of economists, was to help come up with those different options and give a sense of how effective each of them was. But you wouldn't want economists making the decision. You need to get some political strategists in the room. And they might tell you the first one had a 5% chance of passing, the second 100, and the third 80. And to really unfairly caricature the job of the president, it's to multiply those two columns of numbers and decide that 64, which is the last row, was the best of those policies. So this is some of what I like about economics, and now I'll get back on the track that I mistakenly started before, which is whether economists agree or not. And I was explaining, Greg Mankiw and I agree on some of the biggest questions. This is something he put on his blog, and it's that he agreed with Barack Obama that we should eliminate the penny. That was one campaign promise that we didn't actually keep. Economists agree on a lot of things in micro. For example, trade produces net gains, but it also produces concentrated harms. They tend to agree on things in macro, that the economy tends to be at full employment in the long run, but can depart from it a lot for temporary periods of time, and that fiscal and monetary policy can help a lot in the short run, but have a harder time doing so in the long run. Even where economists disagree, their disagreements are often narrower than what you hear in the public debate. So on tax cuts paying for themselves, which has been a big issue in the last 24 hours, there's all sorts of people in the White House saying this. If you listen to serious economists from the left or from the right, you might hear a progressive saying they'll pay for 5% of themselves, a conservative saying 20% of themselves. Both it's saying it depends on the details and how it's paid for, and no one with numbers much higher than that. Most of the issues, though, that we deal with in government are ones where you don't know the answer. And I want to talk about 5 things that you do when you don't know the answer. The first is just looking at data and trying to find a description of the world. At CEA, one of the great things was we got every piece of economic data the day before it was released to the public, and we got to sit there, study it, think about it, and write a memo to the president about what its implications were for the economy. So I spent a lot of time thinking about this. And one of the trickier things is that you're always getting different data with different, saying different things. So if you look at how the economy is doing right now, in Q1, employment grew at 1.5%, which is pretty good. GDP growth, we're going to get the number tomorrow morning at 5:30 a.m. Pacific time, but based on all the data released to date, the tracking estimate is 0.2, which is terrible. And so you're getting 2 very different signals. You're also getting different signals right now from what people call soft data, where you ask about surveys about sentiment and intentions, where people are quite positive and optimistic, and it's rising a lot. And hard data, where you actually add up what's being produced in the economy, what people are buying, where it's not doing as well. I won't explain the basis for this conclusion, but a lot went into it, that I'd place more weight on employment growth than GDP growth, and potentially more on some of that soft data than hard data. And the inference I draw from these contradictory signals is decently strong growth for Q1. Right now, if you're sitting in the White House, this is something you're trying to figure out, but it's more a matter of curiosity. It's a bit more important to the Fed as they decide whether to raise rates. At other times, it's really important. In 2008, we were also getting contradictory signals. The data said the economy was contracting at 4%. Turned out that number was wrong. The numbers were revised, and the economy was really contracting at 8%. So what we thought was a really bad recession, you only found out a little bit later from some of the data that it was a really terrible recession. So trying to put together a lot of different numbers and extract the signal is really important. Data description can also help you pinpoint where to look for solutions to problems. So another example is that slowdown in the growth rate of income for the median household. We took a look at that and tried to figure out what was causing it. And 2 things that a lot of people know. One is that inequality is increasing in our economy. This is the share of income going to the bottom 90%. It went from them getting about 2/3 of the income to half. It's hard to have your income grow when you're getting less and less of the pie. But also since 1973, productivity growth has slowed. The amount of output per hour used to be going up at 2.8% a year, not 1.8% a year. And we did an analysis that just mechanically went through and said, what would have happened if inequality hadn't risen, but we'd still had this productivity slowdown? And instead of the black line, we would have had the blue line, an extra $10,000 per household. Then we said what would happen if productivity had risen quickly, even with the increase in inequality. That's actually an extra $45,000 per household, and the combination of them was $61,000 per household. So this analysis actually placed a lot of weight on the slowdown in productivity growth, but said inequality played a big role too. That didn't give you an answer. It didn't tell you what the policy is. It didn't tell you what caused it. But for me, it actually made me think harder about productivity growth and what we could do to increase it while continuing to do a lot on inequality. The second thing you can do is just use economic theory. And on this spectrum thing I was talking about with mobile broadband, the fact there is that a lot of television stations use a lot of spectrum, even though many of them aren't broadcasting to many people because they don't have many viewers or people can watch it on cable or the internet. A lot of wireless broadband providers really want that spectrum, and you have to figure out some way so one group can sell it to the others, and there's a lot of complications in doing that. We came up with the theory that you could set up an auction where a television broadcaster could sell the rights to the over-the-air broadcaster. Someone like T-Mobile could buy it and use it for broadband, and the government would pocket about half of the difference between their two bids. We knew just from economic theory that that was a good idea. You didn't need to do any numbers on it. In practice, it ended up making $5 billion for taxpayers and freed up a lot of spectrum so that we can continue our voracious demand for it. This is an example of the sort of first lesson you have in economics, which is gains from trade, and something is more valuable to one group than another group. So if that one group gives it up and gives it to the other, everyone can be made better off. A lot of the most interesting economics, though, isn't just about gains from trade. It's about where you have imperfect knowledge, market failures of all different types, behavioral failures, et cetera. And just to give you a quick example of that, health insurance would be an example of adverse selection, where people who are buying insurance know a lot more about whether they're sick or not. Ideally, they wouldn't get insurance until the day they got sick, and then they'd go out and buy it. If everyone did that, it wouldn't work. The price of insurance would go way up, and people would be driven out. And so you need either publicly provided insurance, like single payer, or mandated purchase, or to tolerate a world with substantial number of uninsured people. Behavioral economics is one of the exciting areas of economics. It has been for a couple decades now. And it's had big public policy triumphs, like saying you should make it easier and more automatic for people to save, that is a better thing than just raising the rate of return if you, for example, automatically sign people up for their savings plans. So that's the next one, is economic theory. The third thing I wanted to talk about is causal analysis. And here the example I'm going to give is something that we got wrong, and by we in this case, I played a big part in getting this wrong. We were designing a tobacco tax increase in the end of 2008, beginning of 2009. And we were raising taxes on cigarettes from 39 cents a pack to $1.01 a pack, something that's is going to save 15 to 70,000 lives a year per cohort. But we had to figure out the tax rate on all these other things: roll your own tobacco, pipe tobacco, small cigars, large cigars. I sat in meetings with people on this topic and was sleep deprived, was working on lots and lots of different topics. It sounded really sort of technical and mundane. It also turns out that there's like a whole lobby for pipe tobacco, a whole lobby for roll your own tobacco. There's like lobbyists who just work on small cigars. And the result of sort of inattention, lobbyists, all sorts of other stuff was this. We did a big tax increase on roll your own tobacco, more than $20 a pound, and a pretty small increase on pipe tobacco. And here's what happened. People who used roll your own stopped doing it. People who used pipe tobacco went way up. How many people have seen lots of people smoking pipes since 2009? Right, me neither. Something I didn't know is you can buy something that calls itself pipe tobacco, put it in a piece of paper, roll it up, light it on fire, and smoke it. These two are very close substitutes for each other, and you raise the price of one relative to the other, and you get a lot of substitution. This is actually a non-trivial issue, and we would have had an even bigger health benefit from what we did if you had raised prices on both of them by a uniform amount, and so you didn't get this substitution that undid part of what you were trying to accomplish with the tobacco increase to begin with. And since then, we had a proposal to harmonize the two rates, although it hasn't happened. The next thing that we spent a lot of time doing, and don't try to understand this slide is here as sort of background mood music, is building models to simulate different alternatives. You could build a model for health insurance, and we all saw the CBO model a month ago that said 5 million people would lose their health insurance. Deductibles would go up, premiums would go up, et cetera. We could build a model for the tax system, for climate change, for all sorts of things. And when you do this, you bring together the empirical evidence I talked about, the theory I talked about, and the causation, and try to explain how things would matter. Even with all of that, though, there's just a huge amount of uncertainty and a huge amount we don't know. And so the last thing I'd say, and perhaps the most important, is being really honest about the magnitude of your uncertainty, trying to, wherever possible, have policies that build in evidence and evaluation. For example, we have something that if you come up with something in Medicare that saves money without hurting people's health, you can automatically scale that up. Or if you run an experiment that does the opposite, or that helps people's health without costing more money, you can scale that up. You may want to just say the government doesn't know the answer. The private sector isn't going to be motivated to figure it out, but we'll give them an incentive to figure it out. And there's no better incentive to figure out how to use less carbon than making everyone pay $40 per ton of carbon that they emit. Another thing that I'm very fond of, and I think is an important lesson of the last couple of years, is making policies more automatic. It's pretty hard to tell where the economy is at every point in time, as hard as you try. Waiting for Congress to figure it out and legislate is also not always such a great idea. So doing something like UI's unemployment insurance, taking it so your unemployment insurance benefits go up or last for longer when your state has a higher unemployment rate or saw a quick increase, is a way of building in something automatic so it doesn't require the political system. The last thing which I'm compelled to admit is that not every problem has a solution, but as somebody that comes more from the progressive side, I don't actually have any examples for you. But if you get a Republican here, they'll have a lot. Want to end this discussion by talking a little bit about my perspective about how you balance growth and inequality. And as you saw before, in that biggest problem we face of the slowing growth of incomes for the typical family, slower growth has been part of the problem, and greater inequality has been part of the problem. In some cases, it's really easy, like education can help both of them. Some cases, maybe you have trade-offs, and want to talk a little bit about how I think about that. The first way I think about that is that advocates, unsurprisingly, overstate the benefits of the policies they like and the costs of the policies they oppose. And one way of thinking about this, people talk about, like, if we do this, we could have 3% growth, 4% growth, 5% growth. Let's compare the United States and Argentina since 1900. Argentina has just, had multiple rounds of defaults. They've had military rule, coups, hyperinflation, abrogation of rules of law, price controls. They've done everything wrong. And they've grown at 0.7 percentage point less than the United States has. So the next time somebody tells you, I have this idea to tweak the tax system in the United States, and it'll raise growth by 1.5%, ask yourself, on a scale of the United States over the last 100 years to Argentina, and the difference between our economic policies, is that tweak to the tax change like twice as big as the difference between the US and Argentina over the last century, in which case maybe it could do that, or is it a lot smaller than all of these things? Because all of these things only added up to 0.7. So, you do the best regulatory reform in the world, maybe you'll get 0.1, maybe 0.2 percentage point on your growth rate. Another example of that is France, which has, by, consensus view, just a terrible set of regulations, interfere in their economy, all sorts of regulation, score worse on economic freedom, these indices that all these groups like the Davos World Economic Forum people put out. But it has a level of productivity that's the same as the United States. So again, if we got rid of all of our regulations, if France can have this many and have the same productivity as us, I'm not sure how much more productivity we would get out of getting rid of all of them. The opposite's also true. At 1 a.m. on election night, Paul Krugman predicted the election of Donald Trump would cause a massive recession in the first 6 months. To his credit, within a day or two, Paul Krugman actually retracted that and explained why that was wrong. There's still a month or two left, but while I think the economic policy administration could be damaging to our growth over time, I don't think we do ourselves a service when we predict a massive recession and then it doesn't happen. The second thing I'd say in terms of growth is, all else being equal, if we can get a little bit of extra growth, it's worth doing. That 0.7 of a percentage point isn't the most inspiring thing. In the United States, it would be the difference between the 1.8% growth we've had and 2.5%, neither of which sounds super exciting. But the United States is a much, much richer place than Argentina because of the miracle of compounding. And if you can get a couple tenths more on your growth rate, that's a great thing. 0.2 percentage points is an extra $1,000 for a typical family after a decade. But there's 3 really important words there. And in economics classes, that's often written as ceteris paribus. I chose to do it in English because it's so important. I wanted to make sure everyone understood it. And that brings to the third lesson, which is, in my view, it's generally not worth making large distributional or other sacrifices for a little bit of additional growth. So for example, if I told you that we could get rid of the Affordable Care Act and we get an extra 0.2 percentage point of growth, I don't think that's that plausible, but just for the sake of argument, imagine that that would do that. The Affordable Care Act is worth about $10,000 a year to a household in the bottom quintile. The extra growth is going to get them $1,000 and they have to wait 10 years for it. To me, that trade wouldn't be worthwhile. And you can study, and I've done this more carefully elsewhere, a lot of policies have this feature. You do a lot of environmental damage and you get an extra half of a tenth on your growth rate. And so when it comes to trade-offs, I think in theory it's possible that it might be worth doing something that you sacrifice a little bit in terms of inequality to get a lot more growth. In practice, when you analyze the actual policy options we have presented to us, in my judgment, the trade-off is rarely worth it, especially when a lot of the growth isn't quite the same as well-being, something you hopefully learn in economics, that, for example, if you get that extra growth because people work harder, that means they're losing leisure or doing less childcare, and they might be better off, but not as much better off as just the growth rate. I'll conclude by saying, what I like doing is thinking about public policy, talking about it. I aspire to do that in a rational, fact-based way. Around November 9th and 10th and 11th, I remember a number of people despairing about facts and the type of rational discourse and analysis. It's certainly not where I'd like it to be for our country today. It's not where I would have liked it to be for our country 5 years ago even, or 10 years ago. But it's not unimportant either. You look at something like the American Health Care Act, which was designed to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, and that got analyzed by the Congressional Budget Office. The Congressional Budget Office is staffed by a bunch of economists, a bunch of policy analysts, people that went to schools like UCLA, and they came out with numbers about how that would affect the world and how that would affect people. And those numbers had a huge impact on the debate and made it impossible, at least on the first round, for the House to pass it, and I think will make it impossible for it to become law, even if it does manage to pass the House of Representatives. So, my own view is we need a lot of different things. We probably need people like marching and shouting and stuff like that, which I'm less good at. But we also need a lot more of this too, because it really matters, really made a difference. I saw that happen on the inside in our administration, And I see it happening on the outside now as we're engaged in a debate over a wide range of public policy issues, any of which I'm happy to continue discussing with you now. Thank you. In the Oval Office, President Obama had this bowl of apples, and they always looked great. And the way those meetings happened is he's at the chair at the end, you may have seen pictures, and then you sit on the sofas next to them. And it was pretty common to take an apple and eat the apple after the meeting. What wasn't common, and in fact I only saw once, was to be having a discussion about international tax reform and to have one of the president's top economic advisors, and I won't out Austin Goolsbee, oops, sitting there and loudly chomping an apple throughout the meeting, and so that the only thing I remember from that meeting is the sound of him eating that apple echoing around that oval room, rather than any of the substance we were discussing. So I will not do that for you now.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for your talk. There's a million questions I have about kind of current events, the Trump administration, Obama, but I want to start off kind of in line with your talk about the way economics feeds into the policy process. I'm not an economist. I'm a lawyer and a political scientist. And one of the things I know about political science versus economics is that economists seem to have a surprisingly important role in our policymaking system. You can go on the Hill and testify and say that research in economics demonstrates X, Y, or Z, and people will listen and take that seriously. And that was, I think, the overwhelming point at the end that you gave. Whereas in political science, you can't do that. Nobody wants to hear what political science research has to say, and they don't take it seriously on the Hill. And I've always been struck by that distinction, and I think we can look at other disciplines, and they're even less significant. So what is it about economics that you think gives it this important and kind of unusual quality in Washington?
Look, I think some of this is unfortunate, and I think some of the reaction against expertise in the wake of the Great Recession came from economists who in their models have quite large standard errors, but then when they go out and speak to the public, they forget those standard errors and speak much more confidently than is justified. Certainly like predicting the future. We don't know how to do it. My dentist also doesn't know how to tell me which tooth is going to get a cavity. I don't hold that against my dentist because my dentist tends not to make predictions and does a pretty good job after the fact in cleaning up after the cavity. I think we're better at knowing how to clean up after a recession with fiscal stimulus than to understand when one's coming. But we sort of forget that and speak too confidently. So I think that confidence may help, but then I think in the long run it hurts. I can say for me though, one thing we did at CEA was try to see if we could bring data to bear, and we had a lot of people that were good at numbers. So let me give you an example. Criminal justice reform. The United States has 25% of the world's prisoners, 5% of the world's population. We imprison a higher fraction of our population than any country with, I think, more than 400,000 people. The only country that's worse is the Seychelles than us. It's awful. And this isn't a core economic issue, but I cared about it personally. We had two staff that were very enthusiastic about it. We once had a staff brainstorming meeting to what should we work on, and one person here knows him, Steve Braun, who's in charge of macroeconomics, was like, I'm really bored of the inventory cycle. I think we should be working on mass incarceration. So we went off and wrote a memo. And it was based on a lot of data and combing through stuff and bringing things together. And I just sent it to a few people in the White House, like, hey, just in case this is of interest. They really liked the memo and said, hey, you should get this to the president. I said, okay, gave it to him. He really liked it. He sent it to the Attorney General. And after that day, anytime there was a discussion of criminal justice reform, we were in the room. That wasn't because we were dictating what had to be done. It was because people thought, oh, these people actually may have something to add.
I mean, it's an interesting example because the one that's on my mind right now is issues of credibility. One of the frequent arguments in the Beltway is if you take an action like, let's say, President Trump did with the strikes in Syria, that will show resolve and credibility vis-a-vis other situations in other states. The overwhelming evidence, academic evidence, is that's simply untrue. but it persists. And so data doesn't seem to penetrate in certain fields, whereas economics does seem to have this unusual ability to both have a resonance for policymaking, but also to bring in excellent academics. And it's the other thing that's striking about what you talked about. Many of the people you mentioned, people we've had here, have very good academic pedigrees and yet can transfer back and forth in a way that is not unknown in other fields, but maybe is less common.
Yeah, and the United States is different in that regard than other countries. The top economist in most other countries is the chief economist to the finance minister. And here it's the chief economist to the president. India has one who reports to the head of state. Israel sort of does. I'm not aware of any other countries that do. And the other advantage, the thing that we have, is a lot of other countries, you spend a long time in the civil service working your way up. So that in the UK, the top person is a civil servant. He happens to be really excellent as the economic advisor to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. But in the United States, you have this rotation from academia to government that lets you have, a Joe Stiglitz come to government for, well, in his case, 4 years.
Or Peter Navarro.
Or Peter Navarro. It has its ups and its downs.
We'll talk about that. So let me ask you about trade, because that's obviously right now in the news. The president has talked about NAFTA, and at various times this week alone has said, I may want to renegotiate NAFTA, we may leave NAFTA, we may not leave NAFTA. You talked about trade as something that economists generally agree on.
Well, I had both the pro and the con in that same line.
So I was just curious, from your stance and from your experience in Washington, what's different about the debate about trade today? Just to take TPP as an example, both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were on the record as opposing TPP by the end of the campaign, something that I think wasn't necessarily expected. If you went back 4 or 5 years or 10 years, you wouldn't see that. So what's changed, and how do you explain the different attitude that we see today?
First of all, it hasn't completely changed. I mean, I'm not exaggerating this, I think, in 2000, there was the battle in Seattle over the WTO. I think it was a year later, there's these annual meetings that the World Bank and IMF have in Washington. And there was a borderline riot in downtown DC, and people actually set 2 cars on fire and were marching through the streets, and police were there with barricades all over the issue of trade at a time when our unemployment rate was 4% and real wages were growing at 2% a year. So even in the best economy we've had in the last 50 years, it was still a controversial issue. I think it's an issue that allows people to personalize some of the problems they have in the economy and plays a little bit to a zero-sum, they're winning, so we must be losing type of mentality. I think legitimately the China shock probably has been larger and more consequential than other ones have. Trade certainly does cause a set of concentrated harms. I'm less certain that it contributes. I'm less certain that it's causing inequality because it may create wage pressures, but it also disproportionately benefits consumers of imported goods. I think progressives shouldn't lose sight of the fact that without trade, you wouldn't have had the most amazing economic thing that's happened in the history of the planet Earth, which is hundreds of billions of people in China emerging, in China and around the developing world, emerging from poverty, and just the huge, we talk about like, oh, we're losing jobs to China and India. As a U.S. policymaker, you have to be American first. On the other hand, a little party, you should be a little bit guilty when you think about what a job means to someone in India, especially if they can have that job and we can have our job, which I think is certainly possible. Last thing I'd say is some of the critiques of trade agreements I think might be fair. They include a set of ancillary things to trade, things like very strong protections for intellectual property that I'm less sure are justified, and I do think reflect the disproportionate role that special interests can play in some parts of the process.
Agreed. So on the issue of trade, one of the reasons it's been so significant is the impact on jobs. You showed that very interesting slide with a kind of sharp deviation in the late 60s. One of the things you threw up in your early slide on the many things you covered was artificial intelligence, and it made me think about robotics and the change that we often hear about happening now. I know the Treasury Secretary has expressed some doubt about the impact of this. I'm just curious about your view about what is likely to happen in the next 10 or 15 years with regard to whether it's AI-driven automation or other forms that may hit knowledge workers like those of us here in this room, or soon-to-be workers here in this room.
Right. So I should tell you that one of the fun things I did as chair of CEA was gave a lot of speeches, and every single question anyone in this audience I've given a speech on, and there's an Obama White House archive website that has it. This one is no exception. So if you're really interested, there's a longer version there. My view is there's a powerful set of forces that even as you have new inventions that replace labor, create new types of jobs, make people richer, and richer people want to buy more stuff, and that bring you back towards something like an equilibrium where most people that want to work can work. We've seen that when we got rid of all the jobs in agriculture. John F. Kennedy, in his inaugural, talked about what are we going to do now that we're losing all these farm jobs? What could we possibly do for these people to have jobs in the future? And that turned out to be a misguided idea. So over and over again throughout our history, we thought the next invention was going to replace jobs. Couldn't imagine what the next ones were, and we've been wrong. And today we don't see technologically advanced countries having fewer jobs. There was actually a Wall Street Journal story on, will the robots replace men? And that's the headline. And that article was written with those words in, I think it was 1935. So people have been worried about this for a while. So to a first approximation, the really scary scenarios I don't believe in, and that's why I don't like things like universal basic income that are premised on the notion that we're going to lose all our jobs, we need to do something else. But I do think how we handle this can make a big difference. And one of the reasons people haven't lost jobs to robots in the last 30 years is they've lowered their wages to compete with those robots, and so we've had more inequality. And we have had a chipping away at the participation in the workforce, and a lot fewer people are participating in it now than before. Those things are more uniquely American, not uniquely, or more worse in America than they are in other countries. And so I think they say less about the technological changes and more about our institutions for training people, for helping people find jobs, for subsidizing jobs, for educating people. Mass incarceration has played a big role in people being unable to find work as well, much bigger role than the robots will play.
Can you elaborate why you don't support universal basic income? And maybe explain what that means for everyone.
Sure. So universal basic income is the idea that you'll give everyone 18 and older, call it $12,000 a year. And it sounds like a really nice, appealing, simple idea. It appeals to people who think the robots will take all our jobs. It appeals to tech people. It appeals to others. The problem with this idea is partly the premise that I think work is a really important way to be included in society, to have dignity, to participate. And it's not about that. It's about something else. But then also the numbers don't add up. To give everyone that, there's, 250 million adults. Maybe you don't give it above 65. Anyway, let's say it costs $2 trillion a year. That's 3 times what we spend on Social Security. We need to double our income taxes to pay for it. Maybe I'd be comfortable doubling our income taxes. I don't think it would actually happen. So then what would you end up doing? You'd end up doing what many of the proponents have said. You'd get rid of food stamps, and you'd get rid of the earned income tax credit, because those are old-fashioned, dumb, complicated ways to do it. We've come up with a smart way to do it. Well, the problem with that is the smart way to do it costs all this money, because a lot of the money is going to people that make $90,000 a year or $900,000 a year. So you'll end up with less money for low-income households who benefit from a lot of the system now, more money for middle and high, in a way that if you listed my top 10 priorities, if I could convince Americans to raise taxes, sort of number 10 on my list would be more money for people that make, $90,000 or $900,000 a year. So it's an idea that when you do the arithmetic, it just tends not to add up and work in the way that people would like it to.
Since you have a lot of campaign experience, let me ask you to put your campaign hat on for a second. There are many things that went wrong in the Hillary Clinton campaign, but just on the economic policy side, looking back, What do you think she or the Democratic Party could have done differently and should have done differently? What was realistic that wasn't done that would have enabled them to win?
I think the policy stuff wasn't an important part of it. I mean, people have criticized her for having sort of no clear set of policies, no clear articulation. She had like a whole blizzard of bullet points. Anyone had any problem, there was a bullet point on her website to deal with it. Frankly, and I'm, partly my fault, that was true of Barack Obama's economic policies. That was true of Bill Clinton's policies in '92. And a little bit the way you empathized or communicated it or talked about change overrode any of those specifics. So I don't think a lot of it was grounded in the specific policies. It's possible that supporting Glass-Steagall, being earlier and more aggressive against trade, would have helped her politically. I have views on the policy merits of both of those questions. I don't have strong views on what they would have done for her campaign. And I sort of agree with the conventional wisdom that the biggest mistakes the campaign made were things that happened before she declared her run for office.
So last question, then I want to open it up. Just because you know the president well, he's come under heat recently for accepting a $400,000 speaking fee at Cantor Fitzgerald bond firm in New York, which goes to the heart of some critiques about centrist or semi-centrist progressive politics in this country, and also raises the question of why someone with as much money as he has would do that. So why do you think he's done it?
When I was in government, I was under all sorts of constraints about what I could and couldn't answer. And as I explained it to my children, if you got a question, what's your favorite color? You could answer, my favorite number is 7. And my daughter was like, but that's not a color, and didn't understand this. And it's always frustrating for me that I couldn't answer questions about monetary policy and exchange rate. We had policy that no one commented on those. And I was so excited when I was free because I could just completely speak my mind, be utterly unconstrained. I could talk about a carbon tax rather than the way I used to phrase it, which was putting a price on carbon, and pretty much talk about just about any topic I wanted, with the exception of the president's $400,000 speaking fees.
I'm going to reframe it. Do you think it's a problem for Democrats when they are seen as cozy with Wall Street? Progressives.
Right. I think that can be a problem, and I think Matt Iglesias had a good take on this in Vox recently, so I'd commend that to all of you. And part of his argument was, Hillary Clinton argued against Glass-Steagall, which created a wall between investment banks and commercial banks. She made a set of policy arguments around that none of the banks that had integrated, like JP Morgan, were responsible for the crisis. It was all the pure investment banks or the pure commercial banks. So this wasn't the cause of the crisis. There's another argument you could make that actually places like Goldman Sachs for years sort of liked Glass-Steagall because it helped prevent others from coming in and competing. So this was a regulation that created a barrier to entry and in some ways actually helped some of the incumbents. But she took this view, and the other characterization of this view was because she was cozy with Wall Street. I think she she was right on the merits of that particular one, but it's hard for people to evaluate all the merits. They also evaluate the motives, and I think there was much less certainty about what the motives were.
Well, Jason, we're almost out of time, but before we end, I have it on good
authority. That was a question I didn't used to answer, by the way.
Good. You would just avoid it.
I'm like a free person. I can answer most every question, except you might have picked the one question I would still dodge.
I had a feeling you might. So I have it on good authority that you're an excellent juggler. And in fact, I have 3 apples here. I've heard you could even juggle and bite the apple while you're juggling. Is that true?
That is a really, really cruel thing to do.
Could you demonstrate for us?
Very cruel thing. No one's ever done this to me. Let me say, by the way, I used to do 2 eggs and an apple, and I did it really well. I never broke the eggs. It was.
I thought about eggs, but this carpet's hard to clean.
There was a school talent show a few years ago, and I got out the eggs, got out the apple, and sort of tried to see if I could do it. And the egg broke. And I got another egg. The egg broke. It broke. It broke. It broke. And I didn't think I was that much worse than I used to be, even though I hadn't practiced for years. And then I realized what was causing all these eggs to break. And it's sort of poor form, but I blame it entirely on my wife, which is because of her, I have this metal object on my finger that when I was 17, I didn't have there. And like, you know, the only time I ever take this off is when I juggle eggs. I have not practiced, I don't think I've done this for like a year, so I want to like create a lot of hype and uncertainty about whether or not I'll succeed, and like tremendous amounts of applause if I do, and not much blue. No, don't distract me. Oh!
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.